Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Ecclesiastical Law Society bite-sized discussion. And this evening, I'm talking about APCMs with Jon Baldwin. And Jon is the Registrar of the Diocese of Southwark in the Church of England. Welcome, Jon. Welcome back. Good to see you again.
Very much, Russell. Pleasure to be here.
And so tonight we're talking about APCMs, and it is the season for APCMs. But I think the question we need to start with, Jon, is what exactly is an APCM?
Yes, you're right. Russell, spring brings APCM season. And I think the four letters of that word are quite illustrative. It stands for Annual Parochial Church Meeting. And just to go through them in turn, annual must take place each year. And it must take place every year, regardless of whether the parish thinks there's a need for a meeting at that time. It has to happen every year. Parochial is an important reminder that these meetings happen at a parish level. So for every parish, there will be an APCM. Church, it's for the church community, this meeting, particularly for those on the electoral roll and those the clergy serving the parish. And meeting, it's an interactive event. It's not just a opportunity for presentations, but an opportunity for consultation and discussion. So I think reminding ourselves of those four words is an important way of remembering what the APCM is all about.
Well, thank you. And you said that the APCM must happen, but practically speaking, how do we make it happen?
Well, as with many parts of parish governance, the answer to that lies in the church representation rules. I still have the book here, but they're available on the Church of England website. And the first thing to say about it is eligibility to take part in the APCM, which is particularly important when we're thinking about who can vote, is linked very closely to the electoral roll. And I think there's been a bite-sized session already on the electoral roll, but it's worth saying that the two dovetail very closely together, and particularly this year when parishes are redoing their electoral roll from scratch. It's important to say the first thing to do is to make sure the electoral roll process is underway. That has to start at least 2 months before the APCM, and it has to finish slightly confusingly, between 15 and 28 days before. So we have to get the electoral roll process sorted first. But then the meeting is called by the minister of the parish, by the incumbent or priest in charge, who has to make sure a notice goes on the church door, and it must be there for at least 2 Sundays leading up to the APCM itself. Of course, in practice, they're often advertised in the notice section of services and newsletters and other arrangements as well. But that's how they're called. And it's worth saying these days, APCMs can be held electronically as well. So what would historically have been a time and a place for people to turn up may now be a Zoom link, or at least with that as an option.
Interesting. No, that's something I haven't experienced, but although I have experienced lots of APCMs over the years, I think I've never actually been to one or chaired one where there have been any contested elections, because people can be elected. In practice, often the number of people putting themselves forward for roles doesn't exceed the vacant positions, and therefore elections don't necessarily happen. But if there are elections, how does one go about that?
So one of the important things that happens at APCMs is elections, and there are usually two types of elections happening. The elections to deanery synods every 3 years, and elections for lay representatives to the PCC either every 1 or every 3 years, depending on the model that your parish has adopted. Elections take place at the meeting, and parishes operate a variety of methods for that, ranging from simple show of hands in some places to, and I think I share your view, Russell, that it's a sort of nice problem to have if you need to deploy these complicated routes. But there is scope for postal voting, and there's scope even if one really wants to use the single transferable vote system, which is a way of ranking a plethora of candidates to identify your favourite. As with many things, the choice of which of those you use is actually with the APCM itself. It's one of the tasks of an APCM is to decide how the parish governance should operate.
I see. And I rather got the cart before the horse, because in my mind, I think, well, you need to elect people before you can do anything. But in fact, of course, before one gets to the business of elections in an APCM, there is a certain other business that the APCM comes to, isn't there?
Yeah, so I don't want to overplay the link between parish life and corporate governance, but it's a little bit similar to the AGM of a public company. So if you think of a public company run throughout the year by its directors, but there's an annual chance to catch up with the membership and to let them elect people to the board and to receive an update for the year. It's actually quite similar to that. It's a chance for the PCC to report on what it's been doing in the year leading up to the APCM. And most importantly, perhaps, to present its financial statements as well. And that's another element which can determine the timing of the APCM. The APCM has to happen by the 31st of May, but the sorts of things that can one has to achieve first is, as I said earlier, the electoral roll, but also getting your accounts, your financial statements ready. So we're looking at the financial statements for the year ending 31st of December, but of course they have to be prepared, finalised, and they have to be approved by the PCC and either examined or audited. So there's a lot to get done before your APCM, and that's often what causes APCMs to move towards the back end of the allotted time frame. But apart from the financial statements, we're also there's also a need for a report on changes to the electoral roll, so one can see what's happened to the church community, a report on the activities of the parish and the PCC, a fabric report looking at the condition of the church itself, and a report from the Deanery Synod representatives about what the Deanery Synod has got up to. So that's the sort of presentations that one can expect to listen to at an APCM. But as I said at the beginning, it's also important to remember it is an interactive event as well. And there is a particular provision in the church representation rules that reminds everyone that people who are entitled to attend are also entitled to ask questions and to satisfy themselves as to what they're hearing in the presentations.
Sure, and as I take your point absolutely. It's interactive, and we've mentioned questions. You've mentioned elections, so that's principally often the representatives of the laity to the parochial church council. But are there other choices or appointments for the APCM to make?
Yes, it can actually do quite a lot. There's quite a lot of options in the church representation rules. Slightly confusingly, the rules call the APCM simply the annual meeting. So you'll come across that phrase, which is just the shortened version of APCM. But if you look at what the annual meeting can do, it can do things like set the term length for PCC members. As I said, it could be 1 year or 3 years. It can set term limits. So how long can a given person stand before they need to step down? It can choose the voting system for the parish. It can choose the makeup of the PCC, how many representatives there should be. It has a role to do in appointing the independent examiner or auditor of the PCC. And it can pass, if it's feeling adventurous, it can pass schemes under the church representation rules, which are essentially ways of expanding and changing the governance arrangements in the parish.
So schemes, I've seen the reference to these in the church representation rules, but they seem rather arcane or specialized. When might a parish think we need to bite the bullet and look if and see if a scheme is going to help us? What sort of problems are schemes designed to answer, John?
Yeah, well, there's I would say there's two sort of vanilla schemes, and there's one really adventurous type of scheme. So the church representation rules provide for two types of schemes within the normal Part 9. Which deals with parish governance. So these are sort of expected tweaks that some parishes might like to make. And they deal with sort of two opposite arrangements. One is where one parish has multiple churches in it. So you have a parish with multiple churches, and it may be the case that the parish considers that we need to allow for that properly in our governance arrangements, particularly if we think of an example where you have one much smaller church, one much larger church. You may decide, I want to make sure that, for example, my PCC has at least some representation from the community at the smaller church. So you can pass schemes dealing with multiple places of worship. You can also create things like district church councils and district church wardens to give your second place or third place or fourth place of worship in your parish something like the governance arrangements that apply to whole parishes. It's also possible to go the other way and say, we'd like as a parish to team up with another one of our linked parishes, such as another parish in the same benefice, and do more things together. And in particular, it's possible to create a joint PCC between parishes to take on some or all of the functions of the PCC. So that you can look down into a large parish, or you can look up and across to neighbouring parishes and pass schemes to deal with that. It's also possible, if you are very adventurous, to say, do you know what, we'd like to create an entirely bespoke governance package for our parish. And it's possible, if you look at Part 2 of the church representation rules, which many people sort of skip over on the way to Part 9, that does allow an annual meeting to come up with a bespoke constitution for itself, and it really try to create their own parish governance model. That one's slightly more complicated because you need to work together with the diocese, with the Mission and Pastoral Committee and the Bishops' Council in the diocese. But that's an opportunity for those parishes who really, because of their unique circumstances, think that the model rules don't work quite well enough for them.
And so then it's worth saying, isn't it, that a lot of the things that we're talking about, some at least, rely on the fact that the parish is using the model rules. And if a parish has introduced a different scheme, then some of the things that we say may be different in those cases.
Yeah.
And then the last point really to address would be, we've been talking just about the APCM, as you say, sometimes referred to as the annual meeting, but there are some other meetings that bring in people from across the parish in the course of the year, aren't there?
There are. So the first one to be aware of, and you'll have heard about this if you have tuned into the church wardens bite-sized session, is the annual meeting to elect church wardens, often known as the meeting of parishioners. Now, that's a slightly confusing one because most parishes will hold that on the same day as their APCM. But it is technically a separate meeting. And the key difference is that whilst, as I said, the APCM is for the church-going community, people who have added themselves to the electoral roll together with the parish clergy. The meeting of parishioners for the election of church wardens is actually open to all residents in the parish as well, whether or not they've added themselves to the electoral roll. So in theory, you can have people participating in one meeting but not eligible to participate in another. And if that looks like it might be the case, it's worth making that clear on the day, because what is the meeting of parishioners often becomes in practice an agenda item on the APCM. It's also possible, just for completeness, to say that although one has to run a parish meeting between January and the end of May, it is also possible to run a parish meeting at other times of the year. It's possible for the parish to call a special meeting if it, for example, wants to pass one of these resolutions I discussed at a different point in the year. It's possible for the Archdeacon to call an extraordinary meeting if there's a demand for that. And it's also necessary to have a meeting in the year if there's been parish reorganisation and the parish itself has changed throughout the year. One of the first tasks for that parish will be to hold a special meeting to set the new parish going. So there are a number of other meetings throughout the year as well.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, Jon. And you remind us then of the dates as well. And we wish all the best to those who are holding their APCMs in the coming weeks. Thank you, Jon.